Hello and welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of Historical Humans Reacts. And today we are looking at the Smithsonian, the American version of the British Museum. And unlike the British Museum, well, actually, just like
Whoa,
them.
whoa, whoa, whoa. The American version of the British Museum is clearly the Met.
I don't know, considering this. This is pretty British Museum
Yeah.
esque, where
Yeah.
the majority of the Smithsonian's collection of human brain specimens was gathered without consent, which is a really, really fancy way of saying
Yeah.
stolen. They were
Yeah.
stolen.
Yeah. So the Smithsonian's brain collection and it contains 255 brains, only 4 of which have any provenance tracing them back to individuals who willingly donated them.
Jeez.
Most of them were taken from means such as grave looting or by researchers of the Smithsonian's effectively laying claim to bodies that belonged to the poor, the hospitalized, and those who simply didn't have family members in the immediate vicinity to identify them.
Which, of the 255 brains held, 57 of them come from black people who died in the United States and were obtained unethically. And then 23 of them come from Filipinos, and 49 poor Germans whose bodies remained unclaimed between 1908 and 1912.
Yep.
And
Yes.
it also blows me away because the brains are also in conjunction with the museum's collection of at least 30,700 human remains.
Yeah. One of the fun parts of this is, you might be looking at this, absolute lack of ethics and think, okay, they did that in the past. Why do they still have it now? How are they getting around various repatriation things like NAGPRA, which we've talked about before? Well, NAGPRA only applies to Native Americans, Alaska Native, or Native Hawaiian communities.
So pause real
So,
quick. NAGPRA is the Native American Graves and Repatriation Act. It's the law that mandates that institutions in the United States are required to try and repatriate remains. For those who don't know.
yeah, just we've talked about a lot on this channel, and just with going through that, like why this law doesn't apply, why this hasn't stopped them, why this isn't a part of the conversation, is because the brains belong to non-Native Americans. They're Filipino, they're German, they're black, and as such, they don't have rights and protections under what is effectively the most powerful law we have.
And even to that degree, the Native Americans whose remains are in there, or Native Alaskans or Hawaiians, their remains are in that museum and they cannot be repatriated because there is no provenance. They cannot prove the descendant communities. They're not able to prove effectively ownership over the remains, so there's no way for them to actually get back to the museum. It's one of the biggest shortcomings of NAGPRA because you have to actually prove cultural
Mhm.
continuity. Basically, you have to basically say, like, this is why these remains belong to my people, this is why we are requesting them back, and then the museum still has to approve that request. And a lot of museums just sit on the request forever while they try and figure out or ascertain the provenance.
Yeah. Now, one of the things that is good here is that with all this that's happening, as of April this year, the Smithsonian secretary did announce that they are creating a task force to address their human remains collection. Um, which it's about time, and the museum is acknowledging that yes, all these horrible things were once standard practice in the museum field, and it is no longer acceptable for a museum to acquire material in this manner, to maintain materials that have been acquired in this manner, and basically it's you know this is wrong, and we need to fix that past wrong, which is a good thing for a PR to say. Um, It's been 5 months, which isn't a lot of time, especially with managing a collection of this size. But hopefully there is something.
See, I
Hopefully.
agree. It's a good look. However, there's a few things that I would like to tear apart your argument with.
Yeah, no, I'm not arguing that they are doing this right. I'm saying they're presenting the right foot.
The law was passed in 1990.
The law for Native Americans.
Yes. But even still, they didn't even go through that.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, now they're starting to do that. And the secretary gained their position in 2019 and only learned about the collection in 2020 when there was a formal adoption of policy on ethical return of human remains when they decided to do a full audit of all of the human remains that they have.
And I'd like to create this audit and the information about the brains was relayed in 2022.
Yeah.
So they are, as far as a museum go, acting at a reasonable pace. Of 2022, we found out we have this problem. 2023, we put together something to begin addressing the problem. Museums are not fast-moving creatures.
But then you look on the flip side where you have another Smithsonian Institute, the National Museum of the American Indian, which is the only other Smithsonian Institute to contain human remains. One has ended up repatriating 617 remains, and they have 454 left, which means they have repatriated 65% of their total human remains collections. And
Forward progress.
no, I think that's really impressive. I think that's huge.
Yeah.
I think
Yeah,
65% compared to most institutions at under 10%.
yeah. The average is well under 10% for most institutions that have even acknowledged possessing human remains.
Which,
But yeah,
and
so
I,
and,
well, I was going to say one last point is it also goes to show because the National Museum of the American Indian works with tribes and has tribal representatives on their staff, on their board, working in the interest of the tribes. So they actually have like an inside, which is
yeah,
why so much work has actually gotten done.
yeah. And one thing I will say with why with these brains and why it's only coming up now is, like we said, it didn't fall under NAGPRA, and this has the feeling to me of one of those bureaucratic oversights where should it have happened? No. Did it happen maliciously? Also, no. Is it something that happened? Yes.
And you say maliciously, but I think there is a fine line between that because while they didn't act with ill intent, and I state that as fact, they didn't act with ill intent, they still were willing to accept um, questionable remains.
Well,
And
no, I
they,
don't
they
believe
make point of
I
that.
don't. Yeah, and I don't believe most of these remains have been acquired recently. And no, most of these remains, like the latest date I see on these remains, is 1933.
Which is fair. That was the point in time. And that's something that we actually discussed
And
because we were in a museum studies class together.
yeah,
That one, museology practices have changed and have shifted vastly, but
and and I'm just saying, like when 1990 rolled around and people said repatriate remains, what was on paper was repatriate Native American remains. The Smithsonian Institution has started doing that. However, because bureaucracy, it looks like they forgot to, hey, maybe look at all the other human remains we have, because exploitation doesn't end with one race.
well, and I think that's definitely a side effect of modern culture coming to this understanding that, hey, there were a lot of historical traumas that need to be rectified.
Yeah, and it's just why it took them the 23 years to get around, or the 33 years to get from NAGPRA exists to, hey, we should repatriate regardless of race.
Yeah.
Is that bureaucratic oversight, which is a stupid thing that happens with massive institutions like the Smithsonian.
But I think that's a good point for us to wrap up. If you enjoyed today's episode, leave a like down below, and we'll see you in the next one.